Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast, Community Policy Forum. Today, we have two amazing guests. So, Fiza Qureshi is the CEO of the Migrants' Rights Network, which is a charity that works alongside migrants in their right for rights and justice. She previously worked at the Terence Higgin Trust. Before this, she worked as a program manager for International Medical Humanitarian Organization, where she was responsible for its UK Independent Health Clinic and health advocacy programs supporting migrants to access healthcare. She was previously served as a board member of MRN, the Institute of Race Relation and Health Watch, Newham, and is currently the co-chair of the 3 million and on the board of Migrant at Work. Thank you very much, Fiza, for coming in today. And also our amazing guest, Lauren Charles, is a social entrepreneur and a researcher. She's the co-founder and executive director of NAMAL, which links forcibly displaced people with remote work opportunities. She's a digital solution specialist for FinChurch Aid. Lauren is also a research associate for the Center of Business Research at University of Cambridge. She is also a member of MIT REACT Advisory Committee and the International Rescue Committee, IRC, Technical Advisory Committee for Rebuild, the East Africa Livelihood Program. Thank you, Lauren, for being with us today too. And let's kick off with the first question. I think I'll go for Fiza first. So we start by asking one of the questions about the refugee situation in the UK now. It's one of the hot topic. So the question is, Fiza, I was wondering, what do you think? What are the policies impacting refugees in the UK right now?
I think it seems to be everything at the moment. It seems the government is throwing every single appalling policy at refugees and people seeking safety at the moment. But we would have to kind of hone down on the Nationality and Borders Act, which has really brought home how cruel a government can be to people. So it is essentially about labeling people who are seeking safety as quote unquote illegal immigrants. We don't like that term, we use undocumented, but basically labeling them in such a way to kind of vilify them and make the media think that, and the public think that these people are not coming here for safety, they're coming here for other means, and they're getting into the country, illegally, quote unquote, again, except without explaining that there are no safe routes for people to come to the UK. There are no alternatives apart from schemes that they've created for Ukrainian refugees, and even there's issues there. So it is about, and then it's about the kind of, obviously, along with the Nationality and Borders Act, what was kind of like thrown in there was the Rwanda plan. So the idea that anyone who's not eligible or not seen to be, well, firstly, if they've arrived by boat, they will be kind of deported to Rwanda and then processed there, and processes in their claims will be processed there, but they will not be allowed to return back to the UK. And that idea just, I don't think we could ever comprehend that a plan could be created like that. And there was no way to actually properly consult and challenge it apart from the courts, which is where it's ended up now. So what you do have, thankfully, is a lot of organizations who've kind of stood up and in solidarity with refugees and are challenging what's happening. I would say the other main thing that's happening at the moment is the way that they're treating refugees. So either putting them in overcrowded accommodation in detention centres, or leaving them languishing and in limbo in hotels for a very long period of time. So there really isn't any kind of settlement and kind of safe spaces for people who have kind of experienced trauma, to kind of comprehend what's happening with them and, what will happen next.
Thanks a lot. I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, just to say, Lauren, whenever you want to jump in, please feel free to do so. You were talking about labeling. I mean, the last label, the most recent one was the invaders. People coming to the UK are invaders. I think that language, will justify violence against those people seeking sanctuary. I mean, the second question would be because, as you know, the policies, the UK policies who are refugees, is never, gone any better. How have the UK policies toward refugees changed over the years?
I mean, essentially, they've hardened. They've become much tougher. So when you think about even issues around the amount that asylum seekers will receive to just to be able to survive, that amount hasn't, for example, grown with inflation, with the cost of living crisis. So people are expected to survive on about £35 a week. And that means everything, your travel, your clothing, the food, etc. There's a lot of harshness. There's also issues around not being so. We've got such a backlog in our asylum process, and then you've got obviously the rush decisions and then appeal stages, and that people are just stuck in the system for years on end, not knowing when they might have an outcome. And a decision, and then during that time you've got them sitting around for years without either being able to access education or continue with their skills that they might have and the experience that they have. So we have an issue around them not being allowed to work. There has been some movement on that in terms of the courts again pushing that actually you need to allow certain groups to have the right to work after a certain period of time. But it's a long process for people to have to sit and wait. And then again, you have to legally challenge those decisions. So it's got so harsh over the years. It's appalling. Like you said, the language just is getting increasingly awful to just to hear, because it's not from the far right, it's not from the right-wing press, it's now from our government as well, which is just it's difficult to find an adjective to describe how awful it is, really.
Maybe I can comment about what happens globally, because so many of these things draw parallels in what happens to refugees globally. I spent 18 years living in the Middle East, and I did lots of research on the Middle East. And in countries like Lebanon, they host one out of 4 people in Lebanon are refugees. Palestinian refugees, initially, and then Syrian refugees more recently. Lebanon is going through an economic crisis. Yes, the Lebanese government have still, started to deport refugees because essentially, the country is broken. There is no government in Lebanon. In Jordan again has hosted refugees traditionally. In Jordan, I think it's one in 10 people. I think it's 1 in 10 people in Jordan are refugees. So the Middle East countries are, host a number of refugees. And I find it interesting when we hear Europe talk about a refugee crisis. There is no refugee crisis here. In Lebanon, 1 in 4 people are refugees. Just think about that. In Jordan, a country which is it's a lower middle income country. They've been hosting refugees since 1948. The Palestinians make up a significant portion of the indigenous population of Jordan. And then the Syrians have come. Yes, there's some Syrians in the camp in Zaatari and in Azraq, but most refugees are within the host community. Things are not easy, but they found a way to make it work. Turkey's often gotten a lot of bad press, but Turkey, they host 5 million Syrian refugees. Again, Turkey has given refugees the right to work. The Syrians, they have the right to work. The Turkish economy at the beginning of the refugee crisis was thriving because they needed people to work. And the fact is, in the global north, countries need talent. Canada is accepting 500,000 newcomers a year. Some of those are refugees. Canada will not survive if they don't have newcomers. In the UK, there's 1 million jobs which are unfilled. So economically, migration is needed for economic growth. And yes, on one hand, you understand that, okay, governments want people who can contribute economically, but a lot of refugees can contribute economically. The ones that are able to flee are often the ones who are more educated because they have the resources and they have the resources to understand how to make these journeys. So they are often the better educated, and they could possibly contribute to society because of the education they have. Certainly, we will be doing some work in Kenya soon. In Kenya, in the Kakuma refugee camp, Refugees have been sitting there for decades. What's happening now is refugees are recognizing that they need work. The digital economy has changed the space for refugees. So refugees in Kenya are working remotely in Kakuma refugee camp. They aren't legally allowed to work, but they're finding ways, because why should it be okay for them to sit and do nothing? They want to work. So there's some refugees I'm speaking to who are working for Amazon agencies to do stuff. It's not super high skilled work, but they're getting a decent income. We're starting a training program in Kenya, fingers crossed, to train refugees to be web developers so they can earn a decent wage working for companies in the global north that need talent.
Thanks a lot. I feel like, yeah, I mean, most of the refugees, asylum seekers that are coming in the age range is an asset for any country, because it's a workforce you get. And as a government, I think if you have a plan in place to enable them to work and also upskill them, because in Germany, for example, they have this 3 years program that refugees, even if you got rejected, and you got the letter that you'll be deported back to your country, if you start work and contribute to the society, at least do a visa at the end of it. And in Finland, for example, they have proper program in place that enabling asylum seekers and refugees to get into workplace, because that economically makes sense. And in one hand, they say, oh, it's too expensive, it's too costly to host refugees. In the other hand, they don't allow them to work. And like, you are the reason that it costs that much. You let them work, they will take care of themselves, I'm sure. So we were talking about Suella government's time. So I want to know, want to ask this question: what damage will Suella government's time as Home Secretary have in the context of refugees? I don't know if you want to take that, Fiza.
Yeah, can I also just come back to the conversation around contribution and workforce? So we have been really just unpicking this at Migrants' Rights Network for quite a bit now, because we've been trying to move away from this idea that, use the language of contribution and workforce and economics, because there are going to be a host of refugees who cannot work, trauma, disabilities, etc. There's going to be, language, there's going to be a lot of barriers. We forget that they face the institutional racism that the rest of the migrantized and racialized populations face as well. And also the issue around using that, as we've also been talking about, how if we keep on using economic contribution as the argument when our economy is doing well, what argument are we going to use? Because the first group that gets thrown on the heap is the refugees and the migrants. They always get scapegoated. The economy is doing bad, it's their fault because they're overburdening services. Economy's doing good, well, why are they here as migrants? And we've seen that, haven't we, with Brexit? Our leaving the European Union is a really clear example of how even when migration is positive for the UK will find ways to make it deemed problematic. So, I mean, with Suella Braverman, I mean, we weren't sure, after Priti Patel, what to expect with Suella. And we certainly didn't think that she could outdo her, but she has. I mean, her speech around my dream is to see a plane leaving for Rwanda just smacks of where her thinking is. Her thinking is about enforcing the plan that Priti Patel had put in place and really going ahead with it. So I think we're in for quite a rough ride with Suella if she lasts. I have to say, I think there is potential for her to be moved on, hopefully, because of the language she has used, right, in the invasion, as you mentioned earlier, how that, you saw the consequences of that language with the attack on the refugee centre in Kent. And having that pointed out to her maybe more repeatedly will help Prime Minister and the others really think about whether she's the right person for this role, because it is having repercussions. But I don't think we're in for a rough ride. She's clearly, there is other thing, just to add, clearly her resigning and then being brought back into cabinet was, there was a political play there, because she was very much against the whole kind of growth plan that Liz Truss was putting in place with, encouraging migration for economic purposes. she was very much opposed to that, and we can see she's, Suella got her way, unfortunately, and she's managed to get back in and hold such significant position of power. It's quite crazy. I think she will be, with her legal background, I think she will be looking at all the avenues to make sure that, there aren't any loopholes or we can't get it to court, and I think it's going to be a tough time.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. Someone who's a risk for national security leaking sensitive information and sacked for that, and the six days just popped back up and as if nothing has happened. And I think it's just clear hypocrisy. You see someone who's a lawbreaker talking about lawfulness, talking about people, asylum seekers and refugees should come from the legal way. I mean, someone who has utter disregard for law as the Attorney General. Oh, so yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. And what role can the private sector play in empowering refugees worldwide, Lorraine?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we think about the role of the private sector, and in a way, I feel if we look at the whole development space, the whole space needs to be reconceptualized. The way funding is contributed. And the space that I work in, I sort of work on refugee livelihoods. So for us, the sort of education part and the training part is only a means to the jobs part. And for me, the private sector is sort of key to livelihoods. Who employs people? Who this is why for me the private sector are the first actor that I speak to, because in the work that I do, my organization provides refugees the skills to work remotely, addressing the global talent tech, especially global tech talent shortage. Who needs the talent? The private sector needs the talent. All the talent wars we've seen happening. Despite companies like Lyft and Twitter firing people, there are hundreds of companies that are desperate for talent, and companies are beginning to look elsewhere for talent because the normal talent pools which they usually source talent are no longer viable for them. Talent is looking elsewhere. If a company doesn't behave well, people vote with their feet. So this is where the private sector is beginning to wake up and recognize that they need a new talent pool, and they're looking increasingly to the global south for the talent which they can't find within the 30 kilometer square radius. And the digital economy really has changed the space. So for me, the private sector is beginning to recognize the need talent, but also I think soon the private sector are going to begin to realize that they need to start funding to get the talent they need trained. So in the past we had the big companies with all these graduate schemes training talent. Now the private sector going to start thinking, right, I need 50 developers. Where can I train people in the global south? Can I train refugees to do these jobs which I can't fill? So the private sector is becoming an actor of immense power. And as we see, the relationship between the private sector and governments are often quite interesting. And it's, in some ways, the private sector are often more powerful than governments. I always made a joke that if Elon Musk said, to the Rwandan government, I'm going to give you $30 billion, what I paid for Twitter, if you don't do this UK scheme, Rwanda will say, fine, I'm not taking any refugees to the UK. So the private sector has this immense power to change things for the good. And I feel that a lot of the younger leaders in the private sector are recognizing that they have this power, which can do much more than governments. And the sands are shifting slowly, but I think it will soon accelerate. With climate change, the private sector is going to start standing up to governments, and they already are, and saying this is not in our interest. We need workers. Do what you can, just make us more economically viable. And I really believe that that's going to happen very soon. Governments are going to really have to think, okay, what's more important? The private sector putting pressure on me because they can't find workers, or my constituency. And often, money talks, unfortunately, and the private sector, I hope, is going to win this argument.
Thanks a lot. That's very interesting. So the private sector can also put pressure on the government? Because as you said before, previously, you said there's over 1 million vacancies out there need to be filled. And I wonder how they will fill that after Brexit. And there's literally no other way. Fisa, do you want to come in?
Yeah, no, Lorraine made a very good point around the influence that the private sector businesses have. I mean, they're already lobbying, right? Each sector, you've got the agricultural, etc. You've got them each vying for how can I make sure that our industry thrives. And, you know, you've got the pressure from the membership, the members themselves, and saying, like, how are you going to help it change these policies so that it's more favorable to us as entrepreneurs, etc., etc. And so, yeah, I think absolutely right. They are advocates and they need to be challenged the policies. And as Lorraine said, you know, yes, if you've got a business to speak out against some of these horrendous policies, I think you would suddenly have government think differently around how it's acting and how it's responding to refugees. I think there are things that the private sector, I mean, it needs to do anyway. I think it needs to remove and think about removing the institutional racism that there is, so that actually if you do have a refugee in there and they're working at a, you know, junior position, how are they going to move upwards? And making sure that those refugees are also in positions of power when they get into those companies. That's really, really important. And so, you know, getting rid of some of those barriers and not just seeing them as this is an easy workforce for us to, again, profit off, but actually seeing them, there's more value to them than that. And I think there's also, I mean, you had, and this will speak to the fact that a lot of private sector companies came out in favor of BLM, and there was lots of, we are going to tackle racism and we stand for, let's make sure it's not performative. Let's see the action happening, and for, again, you to connect it to the fact that a lot of our immigration policies are racialized. They are racist, and bridging that gap between, you know, okay, it's not nothing to do with us. Well, actually, it's a lot to do with everyone in society. And so I would then also urge the private sector to really think, as I said, you know, we were talking about language earlier, is how they can really challenge the rhetoric that is already out there about refugees and migrants. So when you hear the language of illegal being used, or illegal immigration, or illegal migrant being used, is to challenge that publicly and say we won't stand for language which is dehumanizing, which is just inaccurate and wrong for a start, but also which harms people when you have those labels. So I would, you know, I'm going to do a little plug, is we've got a Words Matter campaign which is doing exactly that, which is asking organizations, individuals to pledge to say we'd say no to hate against migrants and refugees, and that means taking into account how you speak about them and debunking some of that language and that's out there that we've all commonly used. You know, we just assume it's okay to use, and then when you start to unpick it and you think actually calling someone illegal is actually really harmful. You know, that's not a label, it's not accurate, but also, you know, what damage are we doing when we are reinforcing certain words?
Absolutely, Fizz. And one of the things I'll take on from this conversation is to thinking about the argument for economy, because that also related to language. And yeah, I'm happy to take that on and reflect on it.
Yeah. I was going to say, you know, I like when Fizz said about we have to sort of recognize that a lot of people fleeing aren't able to work. And you mentioned Germany, and when Angela Merkel took 1 million refugees in 2015-16, she was vilified, but they have positively contributed to society. I think something like 60% of them are employed now, and the others are on the way. I mean, that's a huge success. 1 million people in a one-off shot is huge, and they've done, and they've really shown that this can work. Yes, Germany has the infrastructure, but many other places do, and places that don't have the infrastructure manage to integrate refugees. Uganda is a great example of how refugees arrive in Uganda, they have the right to work right away. They're given land. So this is an example of how things can work. Uganda is a poor country, but they recognize that they need people, and they do recognize that not everyone can work, but the number that work, the family members that can work look after those that can't.
Can I just come? Sorry, I was just going to. That's a really interesting point, and it's really great that you do have good examples and how they tend to be in the global south, which is really interesting, right? It's how the global north could look to global south to do things differently. You mentioned, Pakistan is one of the poorest countries at the moment, climate change, etc. It's suffering extreme issues, and yet is one of the largest intakers of refugees. Yeah. I think for me, it's really around just just really like being clear that protection is part of law. It's the Refugee Convention. So I think what we get concerned about is if you start relating it to workforce, then at what point do you get laws like this, as like the UK is creating, which is like, we're not going to give you protection, they're going to give you protection. We're going to put you on a plane and let someone else decide whether you deserve protection. And actually, we just have to go back to saying, like, we have to protect the Refugee Convention in the way that it is. I'm not saying it's completely, right. There are bits to it you think, oh, this could be improved. But at the moment, it's all we have. And we keep that to say protection is protection. If you have an economic issue and you want more people to work, to build the economy, or certain sectors want it, is that's separated from protection. I think that's where I would say we need to just be very cautious. And then when you start, because otherwise, like I said, I'm not going to repeat myself, but just where we could end up with that.
Yeah, I mean, you want to comment, Lauren? You comment.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about the Refugee Convention. If we think of, how it was written for European refugees. And in a way, this is something that needs to be re-examined, to keep up to date with what's happening, with the world now. Just like a lot of, Labour policies haven't kept up with digitalization, the Refugee Convention as it stands needs to be rewritten, reconsidered. But as you say, it's what we have now, and we really need to protect it and sort of hold true to the values that it's laid down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially Article 31, the convention, it creates not confusion, but it gives justification for nation states to interpret in a different way when it comes to talking about coming from first, coming from direct conflict country, and that gives, like, the government, I think that's the whole argument of the government, they have it now, is saying, well, they have to claim asylum in a first safe country. This is all because of the, the deliberately misinterpreting the Article 31, that they're saying, oh, France is not the place that they have conflict on, but they totally ignore the fact, if every country applied that narrative, Italy will be, the country who's taking the most of refugees. Exactly. Greece will be the country taking more than Italy, and nobody can come to the UK to claim asylum because there's an island. How can you get to the UK to be the first safe country? So these kind of things, I think, a little bit clarity. Even though UNHCR tried the best to say this is not what the law meant and this is not how it should be treated, but for the sake of clarity, I think it should be rewritten and reflect on today's whole situation of refugees, because yes, we have Ukrainian refugees, which is kind of European, but nowadays that has shifted. Many refugees coming from Middle East and African and Asia. Moving on to that, discussion is going to be open for both. I'll start with Lauren to jump in. What are some of the things that we can do to get involved and bring greater awareness of the situation of refugees in the UK?
I just want to make this more global, because I work with refugees globally, not just in the UK, because for me, compared to what I see in the Middle East, in Africa, what's happening in Venezuela, comparatively, there isn't a problem here. So we really need to understand that we are all what's that saying in the Bible? We are brother's keeper. We have to look after everyone else. Climate change is accelerating rapidly. Soon, countries in the global south are going to be unviable to live. We're going to get to a stage where everyone, where many countries in the tropics, people cannot physically live there because of climate change. who's responsible for climate change? The global north. So they're going, there was a great Time, I think it was a Time magazine article maybe a month ago, talking about the climate change and how places like Scotland will have the climate where people will have to move to because they physically cannot live anywhere because of climate change. And this is becoming a crisis. It's not going to be conflict. Climate change is going to be what's going to cause people to move. And countries like the UK and Europe and North America are going to have to come to reckoning, because people will physically not, there'll be no way deporting people to this country because those countries will be unlivable by anyone. So we're going to have to really, really understand that as a planet, we're responsible for everyone else. And it's not just refugees in terms of conflict. When we talked about the convention, will climate refugees be also recognized as refugees? Where can people who live in places that are disappearing? There was an article that Amsterdam, because of global warming, the Netherlands is losing lots of land. Where can people who live in countries which are no longer viable to be inhabited, where are they going to go? And that's going to be the real crisis.
Fiza, do you want to jump in? That's a really good point. I think it comes to a point of the definition of safety, what we should consider someone is safe or not. But after Fiza, we're going to go on about that. We got some time left.
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, sorry, it's quite heavy to follow, right? We're all going to end up in difficult situations with the way that our whole world is going. I mean, I would have to go back to, really please join those campaigns, those very active, creative campaigns that are going on at the moment, which is against the Rwanda plan, making sure that those flights, jump in where they say, target the charter flights, the airlines. Please do write to those airlines, because it works. We've had a number of them back down now. So you can see that public pressure, that the private sector will bow down to it, if it's used in the right way. I would also really think about kind of how we still so for us a lot of our kind of our things around, whether we're in a reformist versus an abolitionist space, we really need to have that conversation around, do we want to move to a space where we are not recreating the same harms because we are trying to we're trying to compromise on certain policies. And I will give you one clear example, which is that Migrants' Rights Network, we do not believe in the use of detention at all as any kind of process for anyone who's come to the UK and is being processed or not, because we can see that, just being detained and being criminalized essentially for having come to the UK, not through a legal route, because those routes don't really exist, is harmful. Again, just the mental trauma, just etc. We know that those spaces are awful and have horrible conditions. So there's also a physical element to it as well. But we have then other campaigns who are saying, well, let's end indefinite detention, which is reinforcing that detention is okay. So there's a real dilemma also for us in the sector. What do we support? Okay, well, if we do that, are we emphasizing this is okay? I think we just need to, also the sector needs to really reflect what is our joint vision and goal. For us, it's about people being free to move, whether it's because they want to, because they have to, but that when they are moving, that they are, they're not restricted and oppressed when they do arrive here, which is essentially what's happening. Refugees are arriving in the UK and they're being doubly oppressed by our government. They're either being put in a detention centre, they're being put in awful accommodation where it's, uninhabitable for anyone. They're being given very limited resources so they can actually do anything. So it really is about kind of linking refugee justice with racial justice and vice versa. It's got to be about that intersecting issues. Lorraine just pointed out climate justice being, an issue. It's all interconnected at the moment. So it really has to be about thinking beyond just our kind of the individual issues that we think people have, but intersecting them with all the other identities and issues that are out there at the moment as well.
I'm going to ask you one question, which is, hopefully is not too outside of the scope of the conversation, which is about the word safety. Because I thought about it so much myself. How do we define safety? We kind of psychologically, when we're talking about somewhere or someone is unsafe, is immediately we're thinking about a war, bomb, and bloodshed. But what actually, safety means? If someone, for example, in Iran a woman protesting because they don't want to wear hijab, and let's put it that way, is she safe? Shall we say this person is safe because of A and B and C, or she's not safe? And if she come here and seek asylum or trying to claim asylum, can we also identify that as a refugee or no? I'm going to open the floor, whoever wants to take it first.
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, in my mind, she's persecuted for her belief, for her political belief, because of where she lives, and protesters are being criminalized in Iran now. They'll be allowed to be put to death. So yes, she does seek safety here. She's qualified to seek safety. If you think about somewhere like Lebanon, people in Lebanon, there is no war anymore. There is no government. They have 1 hour of electricity per day. Surely someone who earned $2,000 a month in 2019, now that's now equivalent to $100 a month because of the hyperinflation in Lebanon. Surely that is not, they aren't safe. If you can't eat, is that safety? So we really have to think expand this definition of what it means to be safe. And I think soon, I think the time is coming, we're going to live in a world without borders. I remember when I was a child, I loved maps. I think I just want to go everywhere in the world. I love, that's why I lived so many different places. Soon we're going to live in a world where people will have the freedom to travel because the current government structures are no longer fit for purpose, not just in this country, but everywhere. They're no longer fit for purpose. And people are going to start thinking, we're not standing for this anymore because our leaders do not represent what we believe.
Absolutely amazing. Fiza, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I certainly would. I really hope that happens as well in my lifetime. I really, really do, like that we can go where we want. I'll back up Lorraine. Yes, absolutely. That person that woman who's in Iran being persecuted, it would and should be able to seek safety here. That it is the same for, we know that gender is an issue for, for protection, as is LGBTQIA, as is, religious and beliefs, etc. in from certain countries. So I think there's a lot of people that could say, well, if I turned around and, looked at how safe I am, actually I'm not, and you see that as well, don't you, in Mexico, with how many people try and seek safety in America away from the cartels and the environment that's there, because actually it's not necessarily them being persecuted by the government, but it's about having a body with power, putting your life at threat or your family's life at threat. I was also, when you were thinking about when you talked about safety, I was also thinking about, safety for people when they arrive in a country, right? So how safe is it once they arrive? And at the UK, in the moment, the UK, let's say I'm on the middle ground here, because there's issues like the hostile environment policies. So, having right to work checks, having right to rent checks, this has all been manufactured for aimed at undocumented migrants, and actually it ends up targeting every person who's racialized or migrantized or identified as a migrant in the UK. And then you've got the rise of the far right, and you've got these polarized communities, and then they're housing newly arrived refugees in those communities, kind of almost like encouraging further division to happen, right? And rather than kind of thinking, well, actually, in terms of what these people have just faced and suffered, what do they need right now? They need somewhere where they're not going to have to turn around and have to deal with Islamophobia and racism on their doorstep every day, right? So that's the other thing that I think we haven't really touched upon, is like the rise of Islamophobia, especially with more refugees from the Middle East, kind of arriving. And so I think there's so much there around safety that you could probably do another whole podcast on this. What does safety mean to people?
I think that's very interesting when you talk about safety in the UK. Do you feel safe in the UK? If you say that to outside world, they will be like, "Oh wow, you're in the UK. Why don't you feel safe?" But often, after the phrase is being used, invaders, because that's a very extreme word. I mean, I felt unsafe because when the government saying refugees are invaders, are invading us, colonizing us in some way, that actually go in a way like people can't tell who's an asylum seeker, refugee. People will just judge you by the color, and every single person, every person of color will be a target for far right extremists. I mean, we never see far right terrorist groups throwing bombs into asylum, but we've seen it. They've done that, and there's no guarantee that's not going to be repeated again until we have a government that's serious about how they use, responsible about using the language. I think we all are target now at this environment. So I feel like not just for a refugee is justified to say we don't feel safe. I think for every person of color, every people of color can say the same thing, say we don't feel safe. And Sabir Zazai, the CEO of Scottish Refugee Council, he said he came in 1990s and he wrote a beautiful article talking about, for the first time since he came, now he felt unsafe after that phrase has been used. That's a big statement. So I don't know, but Lauren, if you want to say the last few words, and please say the last few words.
I mean, that's a huge statement, and not being unsafe. I mean, I lived in the Middle East for 18 years as a woman, and I certainly never felt unsafe in the Middle East. I traveled to Syria, to Lebanon, to Jordan. I didn't feel unsafe there. And it's interesting that, people in the UK would feel unsafe. When I decide where I want to live, I think, what is the cheapest flat in the most expensive part of the city? Because I want my children to be safe, because my children are boys of color. They're mixed race. No one knows where they're from. But I always think, how can I protect them? And I don't want to live in a place where I have to think like that. I don't necessarily want my children to stay here. They're bilingual. They can go many places. But I don't necessarily want them, to go around thinking, oh, I have to be careful how I present. I have to be careful of perceptions. That's not the sort of place. That's not the society that anyone wants to live in. This is not just good for people of color. It's not good for anyone. And I hope that with the younger generation, sort of people slightly younger than us, they're coming to the realization that we have to live in a more just society, because that's the only way we can all be collectively safe and prosperous.
Perfect. That really is, because my son is brown and mixed race, and when he's thinking about, he was talking to me about racism. What shall I do? He's 7 years old, and what shall I do? And where do I have to seek protection? I mean, those statements are big. I mean, as like you said, Laura, you don't want to live in a society to think about how to protect myself, how to present myself to the society, how to make everyone accept me in the society, how to be accepted. That's a very, hard situation to, work on yourself every day to be accepted, instead of just being accepted as a human being. Faisal, do you want to say some few words about it?
Yeah. It's so sad that your child is now coming to you and asking those such big questions. And I've got a 4 and a 2-year-old, and my 2-year-old is a young boy. And he's mixed race as well. He's Arab/Pakistani, but he will be seen as black, right? When he moves through the edge. Because I was just like reflecting on, like, even when I picked the school for my daughter, I was like, oh, but whatever I choose for her, what about him? I've got to think about him, because he's going to be more impacted by how he's perceived when he goes through the education system. So really, as you were saying, I've got to, you're second guessing everything that you do for your children and for how you might be perceived and what might happen to them and yourself, etc. So I mean, I was born in the UK, and I have to say I went when racism was pretty much everywhere. It was pretty much overt. You would get called abusive words, And at that point, it was a very unsafe space for any person of color. And this is, we're talking about the 80s, going into the early 90s, started to feel like actually it's being called out, it's being challenged, but you tended to be you still having to challenge, right? Rather than your allies who would stand up. And I think when you then have like episodes like statements like jungles versus gardens, right, by the European Union, you know, people within the European Union making statements like that, when you had all the ramping up of hate around the Brexit vote, you know, you were going to be invaded swarms of people from Turkey. Turkey might join the EU, and then we're going to have more Muslims here. Again, all that, like the rhetoric and the Islamophobia, the anti-migrant sentiments and everything, like from then on, we've been unsafe. I think that, you know, our governments don't make us safe. Like we have to make ourselves safe. And so, as you said, it's about where those decisions that you make that are so important about your life. And I was thinking, I think the safest space I've ever been in is when I was living in East London. I was amongst communities of color. It was one of the most diverse spaces. I loved it. I've now moved out of London, back to where I was, where I experienced the racism and the hate. And I'm not saying I'm totally unsafe. I recognize also I've got a power and a privilege. I speak up. I fight, I challenge. I know what to do to advocate for myself and for my children and others. But, you know, I recognize that I'm in a space where I have to constantly watch what's happening around me for myself and for my children. No one should have to face that, as you said, Lorraine. It needs to be a just and equal society. I really hope in our children's lifetimes, we will have moved on to go and look at people as human beings and, you know, their values and rather than, what they look on the outside, what color their skin is. It's a difficult thing to kind of consider at the moment, especially when you've got children.
Absolutely. I mean,
Absolutely.
Lauren, do you have anything else to add, or?
No, I mean, I just want to say that this is so fascinating. I could speak about this sort of social justice for hours, because for me, my work with refugees, you know, it just goes, you know, it goes beyond the sort of, okay, you're a refugee. It's sort of more, how do we have social justice for everyone? And it really is justice for everyone. How can we live in a world where people are treated not by the color of their skin or where they're from, but by their character? And that's for me what's most important. And I guess that's what I try to impart in my children. It's about your character. It doesn't matter how you look. It's about how you behave and how kind you are.
Absolutely. I mean, when you were talking, I just remembered the two different dream between Martin King and also Suella Braverman. So hopefully we will see that one day. You know, people won't be judged by color of their skin, and the children of the color and the white children, they holding each other's hands and walking on the street without, you know, thinking about the different color. Right, we are coming to the end to this amazing discussion. I didn't want to come to end, but I recognize that you both are busy and got work to do. So thank you very much for coming in. It was very interesting, and thanks for your time, and thanks everyone for listening. And we will come back to you with the new podcast. Thank you.